Okay, our next guest is an author who dared question long-standing belief about the supposed historicity of a Jewish carpenter. His book, Nail, created a firestorm of controversy amongst believers and non-believers alike. He's a snappy dresser, a great dancer, and like all historians, he could probably hold his liquor with the best of them. David Fitzgerald. Hello, David.
Hello, Kevin.
See that, David? They just love you here.
Oh, my public.
Well, thank you so much for coming to the Valley. Dave, what prompted the writing of this book? Give us a brief history about yourself and how you got to doing what you're doing now.
Sure. Actually, it's kind of a great question because I was a total happy atheist for years and years. It never even crossed my mind that there might not have been a Jesus until I started being curious about what it is that he really said and really did, and how much of it was just legendary creation that came later. Once I started looking into that question, that's where all my troubles began. And now, 15 years later, long story short, I don't think there was any such guy as Jesus at all. I don't even think he was an amalgamation of different Jewish figures. I don't think he was an overrated overrated historical figure. I think he was, in fact, a Jewish version of the mystery faith. I think he was the deity figure of a Jewish version of the mystery faiths.
What exactly do you mean by mystery faith, for those of us who might not exactly understand that?
Sure. During the Hellenistic period, and by that I mean, like, say, after the time of Alexander the Great, from around 300 BC until well into the 1st and 2nd, 3rd centuries, the idea in religions was a personal savior. And what they did in this period is they rebooted old gods from old pantheons and turned them into new mystery faith gods. Each mystery faith had its own god or goddess, and they all had their own sacred rituals, like communal meals, like baptism, and all of them featured a personal relationship with your own savior deity. And Christianity, when we look at it, it is nothing more than a Jewish version of that exact same theological trend.
So they essentially took an old idea and adapted them for their purposes and their stories, essentially.
And that was happening all over the ancient world.
So does that explain why you have so many myths that are very similar to the story of Jesus? I mean, a lot of people think it's an original story, but you hear the virgin birth, the carpenter, the disciples, the 3-day resurrection, all that. That's not a new story.
You know, it's not. We have to be careful about taking those parallels too far, because a lot of people will go too far in the other direction and say, oh, Christianity is all just stolen from all these mystery faiths. The fact is, it is a mystery faith. That's the difference. It's not a copycat of mystery faiths. It is a mystery faith of its own.
Interesting.
And we can show that by taking all the biographical information we have for Jesus, which boils down to just one book ultimately, and that's what we call the Gospel of Mark. That book ultimately gives us all the biographical information we have for Jesus. Before that book was written, Christians like Paul and everyone in his generation, they talk about Jesus in a very different way than anybody does after the Gospels start being written.
Interesting. So when you wrote your book, how was it well received?
It's funny. I didn't expect the Christians to love it, and they really didn't. But what surprised me the most was how many atheists gave me flack about it, saying, oh, all their BS alarms went off. They lumped in denying the historicity of Jesus the same way they do denying the Holocaust or the moon landing. That's the level of crackpottedness that they assign it to. And that surprised me so much that the book I'm working on now, and have been working on for the last year and a half or so, is called Jesus, Mything in Action. That book takes on all the arguments I hear from atheists, like myself and you, and points out all the problems we have with a historical Jesus. And the thing I want to emphasize is that we have such problematic evidence for Jesus that even if Jesus really existed for all extents and purposes, as Robert Price likes to say, he doesn't exist anymore, because everything we know about that guy comes from writers who were writing about something that has nothing to do with anybody who actually lived in the first century.
So, in other words, today's depiction of Jesus is nowhere near what the guy supposedly was.
Absolutely. And again, that's true whether Jesus was real or totally mythological. Because everything we have are myths about Jesus. The question is, was there a real Jesus hidden behind all these layers of what we have now?
Yeah, I think a lot of us have a tendency to say, oh, okay, well, yeah, we don't believe that the Son of God was on earth and making miracles and all that, but there must have been some kind of charismatic rabbi at the time.
Right. And, there's nothing implausible about that idea. There's nothing unrealistic or unhistorical about saying he was just one more loser Messiah like we had plenty of in the first century. It's just that the evidence that we have, I feel and other people feel, doesn't point in that direction. And the more you look at the evidence we have, the more it looks like that he's a complete literary figure.
So you're a mythicist, obviously. So what
Right.
was the smoking gun for you when you did your research? Because you actually did what most of us didn't do, is actually go out there and research the thing. So what was the smoking gun? What would actually convince you saying, you know what, I think this is a crock?
Well, whatever you say about what Jesus did or said or taught or was, you have to ask yourself, what's our sources for that? And it turns out that no matter what you say about Jesus, all our sources boil down to the same thing, and ultimately it boils down to that one book of Mark's. It doesn't boil down to the New Testament epistles. It doesn't boil down to what Paul said, because he says almost nothing about the real, quote, historical Jesus. We all get our biographical information from the same place that Matthew and Luke and John did, from the Gospel of Mark. And that seems to be an allegory from start to finish. And in the new book, that's what I explore and point out, that every single thing that we have from birth to death in that gospel is an allegory.
Okay, I find that interesting. So let's say for example that there was a charismatic rabbi, and in his supposed life, what struck you as this has to be a myth? In the story of Mark.
Right. And again, there's nothing unrealistic about that, but there's a paradox behind this that I talk about in Nailed. I said, either this guy taught all these amazing things, if not did all these amazing miracles and healings and whatnot, and yet no one noticed outside his little fringe cult for almost 100 years, or he didn't do these things, he didn't teach these things, and yet as soon as he's dead, we have all these feuding little fringe cultlets, not in Jerusalem, not in Judea, but scattered all over the Roman Empire, that can't seem to agree about the first thing about his life, his career, who he hung out with, who his family was, anything about his life. That paradox alone, that was a huge red flag for me, that something has gone wrong here.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think I stand with you on that. I mean, I wish we had something, even a piece of papyrus that said, yeah, from a Pharisee saying, yeah, there was this Jesus fellow that came in today. He says the Son of God, and we condemned him to death. Or, a receipt for a carpenter's table or something. There's absolutely nothing.
And in fact, the opposite is true. We have all this evidence that, for instance, they were forging passages in Scripture and in historical documents to make that claim. For instance, the two references in Josephus, Flavius Josephus, this first century Jewish historian, he's the only one they can really point to that talks about Jesus. But the two passages where he talks about it, nobody says these aren't forgeries anymore. They're obviously forgeries. They only say they've moved the goalposts and try to say, well, it's not a complete forgery. And it is a complete forgery. There's no two ways about it.
Let me get this straight. Everything that we have about Jesus, that we don't have about Jesus, points to nothing. And what we do have that might point to an actual guy is actually a forgery.
Exactly. And it's even worse than that, because let's say, for instance, that he was a stealth Messiah, that he was just one more Jewish rabbi at the time who taught these amazing things. Where are these other Jesuses that they complain about? In both Paul's letter and in the New Testament, they complain about people preaching another Jesus, another Christ, another gospel. If Jesus really was one teacher and had 12 apostles, and that's where Christianity started, it makes no sense that there's other people at the same time being preached by other people.
Doesn't that make sense somewhat in the historic context? Because at the time, under Roman Empire, they were essentially awaiting a military leader. The Jewish people were awaiting a military leader. That's why they were awaiting a Messiah, and that's why so many pseudo messiahs came out trying to be that guy.
Well, there definitely was Messiah fever at the time, and that's something I talk about in the new book.
You gotta love that Messiah
The,
fever.
the
Sounds
reason
like something
the
from The
reason that
Simpsons.
Christianity starts around the first part of the first century is because of all these rebooted prophecies that were reinterpreted and reinterpreted to account for failures of earlier prophecies. Everyone was expecting a Messiah to come back around the first part of the first century. But at that time, Judaism was so varied and so diverse that nobody could agree in Jewish circles about what that Messiah was going to look like. Was he going to be a military Messiah? Was he going to be a spiritual Messiah? Was he going to be a mystical Messiah? That's what nobody could agree on. And no matter what had happened in the first century, there would have been a group of Jews that could have said, oh yeah, we prophesied this all along. We knew this was going to happen, no matter how the first century turned out.
So yeah, so you're playing without the net. In other words, no matter what happens, you'll score.
It's the sharpshooter fallacy. You circle the bullseyes after the shots have already been put into the wall.
Good one. So, your conclusions in your book, how were they received in historical or scientific circles?
Well, again, the thing that surprised me the most was well, let me back up a little bit.
Of course.
I'm very pleased with the reception that the book got in 2010, and it's still selling in 2015. And I'm very pleased about that.
And it's a fantastic read. I had a hard time to put it down.
Thank you so much. I had a hard time. I didn't have a problem with atheists disagreeing with me. I mean, that's nothing special. But I was totally shocked by how vociferously they disagreed with me. It's like they didn't just disagree with me. All their BS alarms were going off. And like I said, they compared this to like denying the moon landing or anti-vaccines or climate change denial. It's like all their BS alarms were going off. And what I want to point out in the new book is that most of what they are saying to prop up their arguments, they're inheriting from the Christians. Even secular biblical scholars are inheriting what they think are established facts that are nothing of the sort. And again, this is coming from a Christian bias in biblical history, which has always been there, has always dominated it. And as I point out in the book, there are not just secular biblical historians, but Bible-believing, devout Christian biblical historians who have gotten their careers derailed or in some cases axed for things that were far less blasphemous than saying Jesus didn't exist. If they step over the theological line, they're gone. Boom. And I give case study after case study of this in the book. I couldn't believe we were the first people to do this, but apparently we were. We made a survey of all the institutions in America that grant degrees in biblical studies, Jesus studies, biblical history, that kind of thing, and found out how many of them were Christian institutions, and more importantly, how many of those Christian institutions required their staff to sign a confession of faith saying, we believe this and we will always believe this. That's the scary part, is it's when you have somebody say, oh, well, all biblical historians agree, blah, 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 blah. First of all, they don't. Second of all, the ones who do agree, how many of those are forced to agree to keep their jobs? That's a huge question that doesn't get asked.
Wow, that's interesting. It's something you actually hear often on the other side. You'll hear often conspiracy theories about how the scientists are keeping the evidence down. But
absolutely. And isn't it ironic that in the Christian's case, that's literally true?
Wow. So, all right. So besides the Book of Mark, and you can't even call it evidence, do we have absolutely anything at all that can actually somewhat point to maybe there was this rabbi?
Well, like I said, it's not that there's no evidence for Jesus. The question is, do we have any good evidence for Jesus? We have the writings that were generated by his cult, for the first 100 years or so. We have sources outside Christianity that talk about Christianity for the most part, and some of them mention the deity figure they worship. But again, those are people talking about Christians for the most part and who they worship. They're not talking about Jesus. In fact, all of the sources we have outside of Josephus fall into that category. And again, the only one that seems to be actually giving historical evidence for Jesus is Flavius Josephus, and I spend plenty of time in Nailed and in the new book pointing out that, as Bart Ehrman says, even if every single thing in that passage is true, it's just what he would have learned from any Christian on the street. And again, he and all the other so-called historical witnesses for Jesus, none of them were even alive at the time that Jesus was meant to have been alive. So that's something to bear in mind too. Not that there weren't plenty of witnesses on hand when Jesus was alive to bear witness and who were interested in what was going on in Jerusalem, that we wouldn't have an account of him, even if he was just another preacher at the time. And yet we don't have anything contemporary with Jesus at all. Everything we have is starting at the very end of the 1st century with Josephus, and then everything else is 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, even later.
Wow. So nobody from his time. And you would think, if he is the most charismatic figure on the planet, you'd think somebody would have noticed him.
You would think somebody. I mean, it's not crazy to think that no one would notice him if he was just an average Judean preacher. Certainly if you were a Christian and you believed that there were major earthquakes and the sun darkened and all the dead saints came out of their graves in Jerusalem and appeared to many.
I love that one.
That is a huge problem because there's no historical evidence for any of that, not even in the other Gospels. But the problem is, even if he was just a normal guy, why do we have evidence for people who are so much less interesting than him and none for him? That's a question.
You can't handle the truth.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I also love I think there's that passage in the Bible where they have trouble identifying him, and that's why they need Judith to go and identify the man. I mean, he just came through the city with a claim as a king, and 2 days later they can't recognize who he is for some reason. So,
or what's funny in the book of Acts, Peter heals a beggar who was crippled since birth, and the Pharisees just lose their minds over this. They're saying, "Oh my goodness, the whole town is talking about this miracle. We can't hush it up." And the Romans are scratching their head about, well, what's this all about? This is some weird, obscure Jewish thing. And it's like, okay, that's what they're worried about? Didn't Jesus just, raise from the dead and ascend into heaven? And according to Luke, isn't he still alive 40 days later? And yet this is what you're worried about?
Yeah, raising Lazarus and all that.
Yeah, even in the New Testament itself, this story doesn't hold up.
No, and no offense to Jesus, but I think he's also pretty lame. I mean, he goes out and he heals one leper. Instead of curing leprosy, he just heals one leper. It's like he's just turning the tap off, on the miracles. Just short little things.
And it's funny how different Jesus is from gospel to gospel, too. Our very first gospel, it's very no frills, very low rent. And Jesus is kind of a loser, He doesn't always get his miracles right, and sometimes he has to try again, and he loses his temper, and he's kind of a dick to people. And when he dies, he's miserable and sad, and says, "Oh my God, why have you abandoned me?" And it's not until after he gets resurrected from the dead that he becomes exalted he gets a promotion to become Lord. Before that, his whole story is just of a normal guy who, because he was faithful to God, God adopts him as his son.
Is it true the rumor that says the divinity of Jesus wasn't really proclaimed till after the quote unquote famous Council of Nicaea? It's only then he was like a mighty prophet before that, but after that he was definitely the Son of God.
Yeah, no, I don't agree at all. In fact. And I also disagree with the ones who've been trying to say that Christianity was just an invention of the Romans. That's just ridiculous, and you have to ignore like decades and decades of religious evolution to say something like that. But the Council of Nicaea, people put a lot more importance on that for Christianity than is probably warranted, because it wasn't even as if the canon of the New Testament was established there. That was just one of many things they were talking about. And you could also argue that it didn't even solve it, and that Christianity's canon has never been finalized, because all the different traditions, the Orthodox tradition, Catholic traditions, Protestants, they all have their own New Testament canons. In fact, it's interesting. If you go to the 4th century, our two oldest complete New Testaments, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, they don't agree with each other. One has books the other one doesn't have, and doesn't have books the other has. But both of them have books we don't have, and we have books neither of them have. So it's even worse than we think when it comes to how the Christian canon got established.
That's very
Very messy process.
Yeah, very messy indeed. So, in conclusion, will you say they called it the greatest story ever told? Is it a lie?
Well, honestly, I don't think it was a con job the way Mormonism clearly was and demonstrably was.
Yeah.
I think the people who wrote these books, like the Gospel of Mark and all the Gospels that came later, and the people who, like Paul, who wrote their letters, I don't think they were con artists per se. I think they were probably very sincere, but their intention was different than what we expect. Mark, what guy we call Mark, rather, he was setting out to write an allegory about the Messiah, about why Jerusalem wasn't saved in the war with Rome, what Christians need to do now that happened. I think he expected his smarter, more theologically savvy members of his readership to understand that, and for everybody else it would just be a nice story. Because we see that a lot in ancient religions at the time, like Mithraism. The things that their iconography talks about isn't really about a guy killing a bull. It's about the procession of the equinoxes. It's about, for them, what looked like the entire dome of heaven was spinning on its axis. It was turning into a new age. That's what I think was happening in Christianity. They were starting a new religion, a mystery faith. Mark even has Jesus say, "I'm giving you the mystery of the kingdom of God. In fact, I'm going to do it to you in secret so that other people, if they heard, they would repent and turn away from their sins and be saved. But I'm going to give it to you in secret." And it blows my mind that that's still in our Bibles in Mark 4:11, that he has them saying that. That makes no sense for the Jesus that we think of as somebody who came to earth just to save people. It makes perfect sense if Jesus and his religion started as a mystery faith that only the inner circle was allowed to know about.
So essentially, Christianity is essentially a cult that just made it to the big times.
Ain't that the way it always is?
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
just as true today as it was then.
So, I want to take a brief minute here to talk about the appearance of Jesus, especially in the United States. For some reason, where did this white, blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus come from? I mean, this is... Anybody with 2 brain cells cannot possibly think this is real, a real depiction of a man from the Middle East.
And you know what's funny is it's never been any clearer, even from the very earliest depictions we have of Jesus. We've got swarthy Jesus, dark Jesus, blonde-haired Jesus. One of our earliest depictions of Jesus, he's got a short Roman haircut, and he's using a magic wand to raise Lazarus from the dead. He's walking around in a toga. He looks just like any other Roman guy at the time. No beard, no facial hair at all. And then not too much further, you see him depicted as the sun god Helios in a mosaic that I believe is still in the Vatican, actually. It's somewhere in Rome anyway, where the images and the face of Jesus changes according to whatever context and whatever community is looking at him. There's a great quote from one of the early church fathers, Origen, where he says, "And Jesus too is many things according to the conception of him," which I just, you can't make up this kind of stuff.
No, and I was talking to one of my co-hosts on the podcast, Liam, and he was talking about when to sell Jesus to the Norse. They depicted him as a great warrior, that won many battles with his sword and everything, which is exactly what Christianity survived. How Christianity survived all these times is exactly by adapting like that, adapting to the culture that they were trying to assimilate, I guess, in a way.
So true, and you can see that in the symbolism, like the Celtic cross when they went to Ireland and Scotland and Britain. The reason you have the cross with the circle through it is because that was a religious symbol of the Celts, the sun symbol, and you could expand that example after example of that.
So to go back on the blonde hair, blue eyes, I was told that was actually a Nazi thing.
Well, you know what? It's funny. There definitely was a Nazi Jesus, an Aryan Jesus, that Hitler was trying to start. He wanted to make a Aryan version of Christianity. I forget what he called it. I want to say it was something like positive Christianity, something like that.
Yes, that's exactly
But we actually have pictures of like the church the church architecture they were going to use for this church, and the images, and it's very fascist. It's very eagles and Art Deco, and Jesus is massive and muscular, and Arnold Schwarzeneggerian. It's just what you would expect from a church that Hitler wants to put together.
And it's interesting that you see a lot of that on social media. You'll see a lot of Jesus. I've seen images of Jesus, coming out of the tomb, and he looks like exactly he's been pumping iron. He's got this huge chest all of a sudden, one breaking away from the cross. He's built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you're thinking, wow, there's another example of Jesus adapting to our modern view, I guess.
Yeah, there's a great book called The Face of Jesus, and it talks about just the incredible diversity of how people have been picturing Jesus right from the get-go. I mean, early Christians couldn't even agree on how old he was when he died. So some were picturing him as like a 50-year-old, some as a 30-year-old, 40-year-old. Some had him dark-haired, some had him, lighter-haired. You got even into Asia where he looks very Asian, into Africa where he looks very African, and Coptic. There's just, as the quote goes, to have many shapes is to have none at all. And that's it never been truer than in the case of Jesus.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for all that, David. And you've given us a lot to think about. But now this is the time, go ahead, my friend, plug yourself, be shameless. The mic is all yours. Go ahead in your next book, give it all wherever you're going to be appearing.
Let me do that very quick, and I thank you for the opportunity to do that. Well, again, my name is David Fitzgerald, and the books I'm most famous for is a book called Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. I'm working on the follow-up book to that right now called Jesus, Mything in Action. If you're a Christian and you hate the thought of those two books, you'll love this book. It's The Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion, and book one is The Mormons. And believe me, that is fun for Christians and atheists alike. I talk a lot around the country at places like Aposticon and Skepticon and American Atheist Convention. My next talk will be in, let me think, ReasonCon 2 in North Carolina. And then I'll be talking at Gateway to Reason. This month, I'll be on a panel with Richard Carrier and Robert Price in San Jose on Mythicism.
That should be good.
Put on by...
Yeah, that should be pretty good with Richard Carrier and Robert Price.
That's going to be a lot of fun. That's going to be a lot of fun. And you can find me on Facebook as Dave Fitzgerald, or you can look me online at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com to hunt me down or send me an email.
Awesome. Do we ever are we ever going to get to see you up in Canada?
I would love that. Let's make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to lobby the people at Imagine No Religion to bring you down for the next one.
Let's do. And that's coming up soon, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the next one is in June, but I don't know if we can book you for that one. Hopefully, we can book you for Imagine No Religion 6.
Yeah, I was going to say this year has been a pretty tight squeeze, but next year I would love to do that. So everybody who's at Imagine No Religion, be sure to go up to the organizer and say, "Hey, let's get Dave Fitzgerald there next year."
Sounds like a great plan. Well, thank you so much, David. And you've got friends up here in Canada, and we hope to bring you back soon to have more interesting chats like that.
I would love that very, very much. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Have a great day.
You too now.